Hello and welcome to episode number 308 of the Armen Show podcast, where we have been including neuroscientists, economists, and a variety of individuals of various fields. In this one, we will have an investigative journalist on the show. Carey Gillam joins us. She is the author of The Monsanto Papers, Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice. Carey, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Glad to have you on. And I have had in the past Robert Bilott, attorney for representing against DuPont, and he was in the film Dark Waters. And that was the closest I have gotten to discussing with an investigative journalist of some form. Tell me how you got into the field that you are in.
Gosh, I've been a journalist for more than 30 years. I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. I started out covering corporate America, different industries. I've covered insurance and healthcare and the banking industry. And in 1998, Reuters, the international news agency, asked me to move to Kansas and start writing about this very interesting new thing that Monsanto had introduced, which was genetically engineered seeds or GMOs. And so it became my job, my beat, my assignment basically to learn everything about food and farming and agriculture, and which is a very, very big, important business, obviously, global trade. That's a very important industry for America and for countries around the world. So GMOs were an important change and introduction that remade agricultural practices in a lot of countries. So since 1998, I've been covering Monsanto and DuPont and Dow, Syngenta, and other very big companies that are involved in seeds and chemicals that we use in farming.
One thing that came to mind as I was looking into your book was, what does the world look like without investigative journalists?
Well, I would say it would be a very dark place, right? I mean, unfortunately, there are examples, that date back forever, probably, of government and powerful industries, companies, institutions that are not transparent, not forthcoming with members of the public. And they just aren't. It's the nature of the beast. It's one of the foundations of our democracy in the United States that we have a fair and free press so that we can investigate and bring truth to light. And, it's sad, I guess, in a degree that we need journalists to bring truth to light. We would hope that people wouldn't be hiding things that are so serious and dangerous. But as we've found, over and over and over again, they often are. And that is certainly the case with the agrochemical industry and the different things that I've written about for 20 some years now.
Decades of experience in the field. Being prolific is super duper and cannot be competed with. I've always talked about that. Prolificness is something very representative of one's internal forte. Now, one time I spoke with Jeffrey Kane. He was the author of Samsung Rising. He looked into Samsung as a company and South Korea and how they're connected, but not like in the realm of a problem happening. This is in the realm of a problem that had happened. Would you be doing investigative journalism if it was just exploratory, or is it more in the sense of there's an issue and we'd like to resolve it?
Well, journalism is journalism, and you can call it investigative or not. I don't know that that necessarily matters. Journalism is, finding out the facts about a certain issue or an event or circumstance that is important, to more than one person necessarily, that, crosses over in terms of public policy or public health, that affects the environment, these sorts of issues. And so you can call it investigative. That tends to mean it's harder to get at. A lot of the work that I do is filing Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to gather documents and data from agencies like our Environmental Protection Agency or Food and Drug Administration or the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We've also gotten documents from a number of state universities around the United States. And the team that I work with, is gotten State Department documents. We really are trying to get to the truth of a matter through documents, data, and then share that with other people. And so that's what I've done basically throughout my whole career. is just try to, as I said again, bring truth to light. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard, sometimes you never know if you really have gotten to the truth of the matter, to the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. But you just keep trying, because with every issue that we confront as a society, the more truthful information we have, the more facts we have, the better, in theory, we should be able to come up with solutions or protections or a path forward that is best for the larger community. I mean, that's what we strive for anyway.
Mhm. Now, in this case, you teamed up with an individual, Lee, who is in the book. Can you tell us about Lee, and can you also tell us where does the pushback come in this case?
Yeah, so my first book, I've written two now about this industry.
Whitewash.
Yeah, the first book came out in 2017 and was all about, it's called Whitewash. It's about how Monsanto and other industry players had worked really hard to both promote the use of this chemical called glyphosate, which most people know as Roundup. Roundup herbicide, weed killer. It's used by homeowners and farmers and golf course operators, cities and towns, around the world. But how Monsanto had engineered, just this real push to make this the world's most widely used herbicide, the most widely used weed killer on the planet, and really drove it to historic levels. So much so that this weed killer is ubiquitous now in the environment. Our government researchers and independent researchers find glyphosate residues even in rainfall, as well as surface waters, drinking water. It's in our food, it's in our soil. They find it in air samples, and commonly glyphosate, this pesticide, is found in human urine if you have your urine tested for things like that. So my first book was really all about that, and the history and the data and the documents and the company strategy and the impacts on the environment as well as human health and what science was showing us. This second book that I did, the Monsanto Papers, was really, and this just came out in March of 2021, but really a much better, more human interest story, I suppose. And this is the very first person, Lee Johnson, very first person in the world to take Monsanto to court, alleging that exposure to these Roundup glyphosate weed killers caused him to develop this type of cancer called non-Hodgkin lymphoma that he's been told, will kill him very shortly. He was initially told that he had about 18 months left to live, but he has outlived that diagnosis now. But his trial was just filled with so much drama and intrigue and twists and turns and documents revealed from inside Monsanto's long secret files. Just as I watched it unfold, I thought, I've got to write a book about this. This is just so fascinating and compelling. So that's where the book came from. And yeah, I got to know Lee pretty well, and he's an amazing person. Just what he's gone through, confronting his own mortality and this extremely painful type of cancer that he has, and then going up against Monsanto in court. He's an incredible person.
Is it the human condition that is the strongest motivator for this kind of work? Because without the connection to the person, it's hard to make it a thing. It's just a company and sales and products. But then when a person is impacted, suddenly it's like, oh, wait a minute, this is John.
Yeah, and that's the case with all really good journalism, I think, is you bring it back to a personal level so that people can feel it and can care about it. When I many years ago was writing about the impact of the Iraqi war, the war in Iraq, and so many lives that were being lost, and soldiers and other. One of the ways that I told one of those stories, I mean, there were many stories, but was to go to the home of a widow who was receiving, the flag and the remains of her husband being brought back, and to tell her story, and to tell a story of a young soldier getting ready to go off to war and the farewell party that his family had for him. I mean, I think it's always important to show the humanity and to engage the empathy of readers. as I said, so they will care. So this book is really devoted to cancer patients, people who are suffering from this disease or who have lost people from this disease. And you really get a window into that world in this book, I think.
Now, how does Lee, as one person, relate to or connect with the various people affected by Monsanto? How much is he the representation of a lot of people? How many people are involved in this kind of scenario?
Well, in the United States, over 100,000 people are involved in the litigation, have sued this company, Monsanto, which is now actually owned by a German pharmaceutical company, Bayer. But yeah, over 100,000 people similarly situated to Lee developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma that they allege is due to their exposure to these Roundup glyphosate-based weed killers. And the company Bayer has now agreed to, they've lost all three of the three trials that have been held to date, Lee Johnson's and then two subsequent trials. And the last trial, the jury found over $2 billion in damages was due to a man and wife who both developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma after spraying this glyphosate-based weed killer very routinely around their properties. So Bayer has decided that they want to settle the litigation. They don't want any more trials. And they've agreed so far to pay out about $11 billion to try to settle that. They're not having full success. More lawsuits are being filed, more trials look like they're coming, but this litigation is something that has reverberated around the world and made different countries look at perhaps banning glyphosate entirely. Mexico has said that it will ban glyphosate as of 2024. Many other countries, France, Germany, Italy, have looked at restricting use. New York City just passed a ban in public spaces on glyphosate and other pesticides. The world is waking up to the dangers that these pesticides bring with them to human and environmental health.
As far as Monsanto, what was their counter argument to this issue? How can they defend against a person having cancer in relation to their product? What's the pushback there?
Yeah, I mean, the science, this is one thing I've learned in all my years of reporting. Science is rarely, I would say, maybe absolute, at least in initial stages. And there have been, of course, decades now of scientific inquiry into the health impacts of glyphosate and glyphosate-based weed killers. But there still is a divide, perhaps. You have a lot of scientists, independent scientists in particular, who've been doing research and studying the literature, who believe very definitely this shows carcinogenic properties and causes cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, classifies glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen with an association to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. But Monsanto and our Environmental Protection Agency in the US, regulators in Europe, regulators in Canada, and many other countries say, no, the evidence is the opposite. The science does not show that glyphosate is a carcinogen. And they point to a number of studies that have been done by the companies, Monsanto and other companies that sell glyphosate. And they look at those studies and say those studies provide them with evidence that it is not carcinogenic. So Monsanto in the trials made much of that and brought in their own experts and talked about science that shows that it doesn't cause cancer in their analysis, in their view.
One question that came to mind is that glyphosate is the focus of this, and this is their product. Is there an alternative product that is not as carcinogenic that they could have easily switched to that makes sense, or not really?
Glyphosate came into popularity really as one of the very most effective and the safest herbicides brought to market. And there really isn't another herbicide and wasn't at the time like it. It was considered very novel, very groundbreaking. Farmers had been using a lot of a chemical called paraquat, for instance, which is another weed killer. Paraquat is something that is so dangerous that if mixing it up, some of it would splash or something into into your mouth or into your face, you were probably going to die within 7 to 10 days. It was so acutely toxic, and farmers knew that. So glyphosate, when it came around, some people would joke that it was safe enough to drink. It was sort of the opposite of paraquat. It wasn't going to kill you if a little bit got in your mouth. But studies over the long term, of course, have shown that it might be uniquely dangerous in terms of the impact, on DNA and its ability to damage DNA. And there's other science that shows that it potentially is having a very harmful impact on the microbiome, the gut bacteria, if you will, that affects the human immune system. And it's been shown to be damaging to the health of the soil and the environment overall. And a lot of this concern has built as the use of glyphosate is built, because it stands out now, because it has been used so widely, and the push to use 300,000 pounds a year in the United States right now, where in the 90s they were using 20, 25 million pounds a year. So it's part of the overuse, I think, that has created quite a problem. But still, farmers and others really have very few resources in terms of synthetic pesticides, synthetic weed killers. There are a whole array of tools in the arsenal for those farmers who are looking for more natural techniques, and more time-honored, regenerative, or sustainable practices, like using cover crops and rotating crops more and that sort of thing. So, if you talk to a farmer who's still using glyphosate, they're typically going to be using other chemicals as well, piling them on top of glyphosate to try to kill weeds at this point.
That makes sense. Professor Bill Sullivan, I once talked to about the importance of gut bacteria. Paraquat would clearly affect gut bacteria, so not recommended to casually put in a smoothie. Makes sense. Now, other than Lee, who are individuals you would come across in examining this case? Lee was the main contender here, but who else comes across in the process?
Yeah. Well, of course, through this process, I've met so many plaintiffs, so many people who have cancer themselves, or their spouse, or they've lost somebody, and that's just so heartbreaking. To talk to those people. I was talking to a woman this morning, whose husband is dying of cancer, and she's there among the plaintiffs. But in the book, you get to know not only Lee and his family and his children, but this team of kind of really standout lawyers, kind of eclectic. Some of them are a little bit wonky, wacky, different. They're each different. This team that brought this Roundup litigation to court and made history. But you meet them all. There's his lead attorney in the beginning was a man named Mike Miller, who's a Virginia attorney, a guy who cut his teeth on pharmaceutical cases. There's another gal in Denver, Amy Wagstaff. She's a products and pills gal. None of them had ever really taken on a pesticide company. And surely none of them had ever dealt with Monsanto. And you find, as you follow this team in the book and you follow how the case unfolded, they were just astonished at some of the tactics that they saw Monsanto employ in the legal world. And they'd never come up against a company that would do the things that Monsanto did. So, it's a fascinating. It was fascinating to watch. It was fascinating to write about it, and I hope that readers think it's fascinating to read about it all.
Shout out to the readers, and I believe they do. I must say, how those attorneys went kind of wacky in switching from what they were doing to something else. I've always noticed that some of the best efforts or material in life comes from you were doing something for a while and then you completely switch and there's this thing that's out of your bounds and then that becomes something you do great at. Is this any sort of out of bounds for you from before in some way? What is a big out of bounds you have had in your existence where you kind of forked in the road in your existence?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. There's probably a lot of them.
I do these challenge questions.
I think writing a book was certainly a big challenge for me, and it was not my idea, and it was certainly not my desire when I wrote the first book. The publisher actually came to me. I was working at Reuters, a very busy, intense schedule, an international newswire. and they had seen all the articles I'd been writing about, this agrochemical industry, and said, could you write a book about it? And I said, good Lord, no. But I ended up then leaving Reuters at the end of 2015 and joining a nonprofit group to do more research into these issues, and then starting this book. And writing a book is hard. I mean, I know a lot of people have done it and are very prolific at it. It's incredibly time consuming, I think, and intense, and you just lock yourself away from the world. And so now writing two books in the last 3 years, 4 years, has been a journey for me, and I've learned a lot, and it's become something I'm quite passionate about now, is trying to take what I learn about the agrochemical industry and pesticides and the impact on health and environment, and to share that with as many people as I can, because there's so many, what I've learned, and what I guess is obvious maybe to a lot of people, is there's so many environmental contaminants in our world now, that we have created and allowed for expediency and for, just the ability to do things easier or faster. But what we're doing is we're polluting our water, air, food, and we're polluting our bodies. And we're seeing that in cancer rates. We're seeing that in childhood illness rates. We're seeing that in Parkinson's and autism and ADHD and fertility issues. And we're creating a really, really scary, sick world for our future generations. And we need to see that and to do something about it.
This is an issue I have discussed in various contexts with individuals. Sustainability is one of the heftiest things of the next couple decades. Now, one thing you mentioned, the book writing, I always talk about that. The heftiness of writing a book is a big deal to me. That's why I like books, because to get to the point where you have a solid package and an idea and all the supporting content, that's not light. And I think most people are not able to do it. If you go to the bookstore, you think, wow, a lot of people are able to do it. That's a very, very small minority of the public that is able to have something they want to say, puts it together cohesively, does the research. It's great how much research comes through with the book, and then it comes out into a whole package, and that stays forever. You've now written the 2 books. Those 2 books are there. They will remain there. That's the cool thing about books. That's a full timeless entity of sorts.
So yeah, and I want to say with those books, because of my experience covering Monsanto for so many years, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Monsanto, but they, I've covered really big banks and, other big chemical companies and very powerful players, but no one like Monsanto in terms of the tactics, techniques, the pressure points, the harassment, the intimidation, the threats, the things that that company has been willing to do to try to silence people or intimidate them, to discredit them. And they tried to do this to me. We were able to get some internal documents from Monsanto through this litigation that showed that they had a whole plan, a whole spreadsheet basically designed to take down my first book, Whitewash, and discredit it and discredit me. And that played out and has played out against me for years now. And, realizing that I'm just one little person, but seeing the level of attention and effort and resources that they put to attacking me, that is played out around the world in much bigger ways against scientists and, really anybody who's tried to challenge them. And we did see them try to do this against the International Agency for Research on Cancer as well, trying to smear the names of these, really sort of gold star, very renowned scientists who've built their career studying cancer science and writing papers and trying to smear them. So it's a long way of saying my books were even that much more. They're nonfiction. They're based. Every word is locked down, documented. Based on nothing but facts. And so you can't take liberties. You've got to lock it down. The first book won 3 awards, including a Rachel Carson Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists, and I was asked to speak to the European Parliament and all around the world, really, about my findings. And the industry hasn't been able to knock it down. at all, but they sure keep trying.
Right.
So
You know, I like that you mentioned the Rachel Carson Award at the same time. I always think there's a counter force. So if there's hefty pushback in some form, which is threatening and or uh, not warm energy, if you will, then that is almost always paired up with a counter force of grades for somebody tackling something. Because if it's not taken on, you can stay in the neutral world. It's like that quote, boats are safe in harbor, but that's not what boats are meant for. It's like if they're just there, they'll stay clean. They won't get all kinds of rust and damage or whatnot, but they didn't build the boat, so it would stay docked and just not move at all.
that's
So
a great quote. That's a good observation.
I think about these things. I'm very personality and quote kind of content driven, sort of philosophers, if you will. One thing that comes to mind is before you go at such a topic, do you think in the back of your mind, okay, I am taking on this corporation, this entity. There's definitely pushback, and that's why you're very careful with all the facts in the book.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And I've done that my whole career, really. I mean, you're going to make mistakes. Everybody does. You're going to, mess up the spelling of a name or get a date wrong or, something like that, or sometimes much bigger errors. But if you don't have the trust of your reader, if you can't back up what you're saying, then there is no reason for trust. And so, yeah, I've always been exceedingly cautious about fact checking backwards and forwards and up and down. And I'm astonished a lot to see how the respect for that seems to have ebbed so greatly, in recent years. And you see so many things on the internet now and through social media that just are completely made up, just complete fantasy. And it's sad and it's hard for, I think, the just every average reader to know, well, what is true and what isn't true. And I mean, just as a small example again,
We like
about
examples.
well, I mean, there was an article written about me, and a couple of weeks ago by this group that
Very
has
recent.
gotten funding from Monsanto. They were a front group, and I've written, we have documents where they're begging Monsanto for more money, and Monsanto's giving them money, and they're exchanging. They're saying, we're going to help you defend, your chemical. Give us some more money. So it's this group, and they write terrible things about me and other journalists and scientists and everything. But they just wrote this thing a couple of weeks ago about how I was working for the law firms who have sued Monsanto and had a financial relationship and had met 6 times in this law firm office, very specific things, none of which were true at all, remotely. And they had no proof, no documentation, no anything. And when I put it out to them, like, this is ridiculous, they said that it was up to me to prove it wrong. It wasn't up to them to prove it right. And of course, that's just insane. But I think you see so much of this on a whole array of topics now, and intentional misinformation and intentional distractions, and certainly industry and institutions that have a lot of money and have a lot of power can really create a lot of confusion about important issues, and that's something we need to figure out a way to deal with, I think.
You can kind of feel it from the content that it's almost like a money to tire you out. Almost, it's almost like, hey, Carey, you're a terrible person. Can you give us 3 reasons why you are a good person? And now you have a job to do of like, okay, let me go ahead and collect these 3 reasons. Wait, I didn't have to do anything yesterday, but now I have to collect these 3 reasons why I'm this. So it's like qualification from nothing, which it would just tire me out if it was happening. So it's almost like money meant to just tire you out so that you are not making an effort.
Oh, it's harassment, and they've done it. There's a couple of scientists that were part of this World Health Organization meeting that they have just, spent endless amount of hours and time writing horrible things about that aren't true. Other journalists, Pulitzer Prize winning journalists for the New York Times, that they've written articles about calling these reporters liars, and that sort of thing. It's just, but I still get people, friends of mine or somebody who'll say, oh my gosh, did you see this horrible thing written about you on the internet? Like, well, we're not gonna worry about that.
Right? Somebody pulls up a paper. Carey, did you know you're terrible because of these three things? You wouldn't have known unless you
Oh
read
gosh,
this.
one of them a long time ago was that I was a foreign agent. Let's see, no, I was an unregistered foreign agent acting on behalf of Russia to try to undermine, faith in our food supply or something like that. It's just ridiculous stuff.
I didn't know I was speaking with a foreign agent speaking on behalf of Russia. Okay, everybody who thought I was speaking with an author, that is just put to the side. Foreign agent right here. That's true. If you have you can either counter points. There's like a popular podcast in Miami lately where they talk to a lot of guests and they have them on the show. And when somebody can't counter a point, or this is on a lot of shows, not just that one, when a point cannot be fully countered, suddenly it's like discredit the person, all these other tactics, because the point now has been left alone. In life, I've noticed if I'm ever having a discussion with somebody and they switch from the points, I'm like, okay, I won, or not won, but like clearly you didn't have a counter on the logic is very objective. There's no out of it.
Yeah, I think clearly that's a sign that you don't have a lot, a good factual counterpoint when you switch to a personal attack. So, but again, I think we see so much of that in our society now, and I wish people would think that. I think the COVID and the pandemic certainly didn't do anything to aid that. I think we're still in a dark place, a dark, mean place a lot in our social interactions, social media interactions at least.
Especially when you're actually saying something, which is happening in this case. There's going to be a lot of, I've thought about that. Like there's the neutral, and then how far do you want to go into making, and then you're going to get some negative on the counter. I'm very cautious about what I talk about because there's too much like pinpoint making people offended in some way. Mm-hmm. One thing that comes to mind is, are there any other people along the lines of what you do who you have seen as an example who have also maybe taken hits battling some organization in the same way?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think almost anybody, right, who's who's raised a hand and said, "Hey, hold on, the narrative, the story being told by this very powerful industry, is not necessarily true." And we should look deeper. I think anyone in that space or taking that role has been attacked over history. I mean, if you look back, Rachel Carson, I've got a photo of Rachel Carson back here. Silent Spring, the author and scientist who warned us, decades and decades ago about indiscriminate use of pesticides and how it was going to do so much damage to our natural world and to our health. She's been proven right over and over again. But still, she was attacked back then. She died of cancer. She's still been attacked on so many people, so many journalists, scientists, our politicians. I mean, the list goes on and on. Linda Birnbaum is a scientist who I just hold in really high regard, and she ran our National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences and National Toxicology program for years and years and years. She's a career scientist. She just retired, I think it's been 2 years ago now. But she came under just intense attack from members of Congress and companies because she was one of the people warning and saying, look at the science, look at the body of information that we have about the dangers of environmental contaminants like pesticides and other chemicals that are being widely used, and look at the damage that we know is being done, and we have to address this in some way. That message almost, she was attacked, as I said, by members of Congress. They went after her, they tried to get her fired. She had some of her work censored. Many scientists I've talked to in our U.S. government, have had their work censored, or will only speak to me, secretly because they're afraid of getting fired if they speak truth. It's not the way the system should work at all.
When you mentioned pesticides, you reminded me, just like last week, I got from our water agency, a monthly report, and I was looking through it in detail for some reason, just to check. And there's a disturbing amount of pesticides that are in materials where like they have certain ranges of levels that they'll allow. And the reason for these is pesticides or farming or certain, and just, it's now part of the system and they have to deal with it and they have their filtering processes. But you could tell that you're seeing the after effects of what you're referring to in organizations pushing beyond their bounds, and now everybody has to deal with it, whether you take the hits for bringing it up or not. It's showing up now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Food and Drug Administration every year puts out a report about pesticides in foods. And because we know pesticides are in food because they're used in farming. And so the USDA and the FDA both every year try to do a sampling to keep sort of an idea about these pesticide levels in our foods. And, in the most recent FDA one, they found 212 different types of pesticides in the food that they were sampling. And this is commonly consumed. This is food that they get off grocery store shelves or from suppliers to the US. They look at some that comes in from outside the US, imported food. But these are fruits and vegetables and fruit juices and, cereals and grains and bread and that sort of thing. And 212 different types of pesticides. And, these are foods that people are feeding their families every day. And, that some of them, chlorpyrifos was right up there as one of the most prevalent found. Chlorpyrifos is known to be neurodevelopmentally damaging to children. It's so dangerous for kids that many countries have already banned it. Our own scientists in the EPA have said no amount of this is safe in our food or water, and yet it's still being allowed, in our food and water. So, this glyphosate certainly is not the only pesticide we need to worry about. I describe Monsanto and glyphosate as sort of the poster child for the bigger problem. But when you have a food system that is awash in these synthetic pesticides, and so many of them have been shown to be harmful to our health, and you're eating food every day with these pesticides in it. So even if you're not somebody out there spraying, or you're not live near a farm or live near a golf course, or you're not spraying these chemicals around your own yard, you're still being exposed through your diet. And, in the case of some of them, like glyphosate, through rainfall, through air. It's hard to get away from them. And we know that they hurt our health, and we know they hurt the environment, and we should care about it.
That makes sense. Speaking of caring, I can sense that you have a strong level of empathy. I feel that. And so what might you say are 2 or 3 features of yourself that are definitive characteristics you identify with? These questions are so cool for me because I'm really personality oriented.
Well, I mean, the first one, my husband jokes about this all the time. I got it from my father. We were at a memorial service for him. He died of cancer last year. We were at a memorial service.
Rest in peace.
And thank you. Some of his friends were saying, about how outspoken he was, and how he was somebody who, didn't mince words and didn't have time for nuance and, niceties. He was going to drag you to the truth, and force the hard conversations. And, my husband, I guess, is sort of the same about me. I have no filter. If it's true and it's important, let's talk about it. And, you don't worry about if it makes people mad or makes people don't like you. If it's true and important, you talk about it, you deal with it. And, tenacity, that's something, again, I get my teeth into something and I don't want to let it go. And, it's really hard people keep telling me to stop. It just kind of makes me want to keep going more, I guess. So, and empathy. I mean, that's the glue that holds us all together, right? That for community and society and family and friends, and it's caring about other people and trying to put yourself in their shoes and trying to see the world through their perspective and their lens, and seeing value in that. Again, I think so many people want to lock themselves into one side or another, one position or another, and don't want to ever consider the gray that's between the black and white. And I think that's where a lot of solutions probably lie, is in the gray area. It's not forcing someone to completely come over to your side or vice versa. It's, meeting in the middle. So, that's why when we talk about pesticides, I'm somebody who hasn't ever said, yes, we definitely need to ban glyphosate, which a lot of people say. But I think we need to understand the risks, and we need to come up with balanced approaches that better protect people and better protect the environment. And maybe that's a ban in certain places. Maybe it's more restrictions Maybe it's a warning label so that people can be more aware of the risks that they're facing. Maybe you don't spray it directly on food crops. I mean, there's a whole array of gray, between the black and white. So I think that's another characteristic I have. I'm always looking in the middle.
The gray area is a wonderful place. I think I actually had one episode, maybe I talked about it extensively, because it's not so hard hitting and it leaves more room for open-ended connection. Whereas hard hitting items, it's either open or closed. And now if it's closed, that person's gone, that person's gone. Now you're on an island, you don't really have the networking effect. And I like that, like connecting with this person and they have an idea and then that person proposed this, and it starts to build up momentum in that way, the gray area of sorts. What is one message you would want all people to know or take away from this, specifically the Monsanto papers?
There are a lot of them. I guess
Narrow it down to the top 6.
Cancer, there's 2. I'm going to say 2. Cancer is killing way too many people. And if even the people it doesn't kill, 40% of men and women in the United States right now, and I don't know the stats for all the other countries. I know in Canada it's about the same, but in the US, 40% of people living in the US are expected to get cancer in their lifetimes. And that includes way too many children. And that is a percentage that is way too high, in my opinion. That is not acceptable. It's not something we should just learn to live with and accept. And my mom and my dad and my cousin and my neighbor and my, are all going to have some form of cancer, but they'll be okay because they'll get chemo or radiation or take pills or have surgeries or, no, we need to address the root causes and we need to do something about it. So, we shouldn't be living with cancer. We should be living without cancer. And that is one message, I guess. And the other message of the book is this plaintiff's bar, this mass tort litigation. I really do a deep dive into how these mass torts work and how they come to trial in this book. And I found it's a really imperfect system, and there's a lot of good and bad and ugly, a lot of gray area, right? It's not,
Yes.
It's not necessarily great for everybody, not necessarily great for the plaintiffs who they're supposed to be representing, but it really is the only way we have right now to address corporate wrongdoing or corporate misconduct or defective products or harmful products, because our regulators are not doing the job. And if our lawmakers and our regulators were doing a better job, maybe we wouldn't need the plaintiff's bar. We would need these lawyers who hold these corporations to account, who bring them to trial. But it's the best system we have right now. It's the only way. It's the tobacco industry. It's defective airbags in cars. It's a whole array of things that have been harmful to people that we've discovered. You talked about Rob Bilott and Dark Waters and DuPont and that terrible poisoning that was going on, and it took basically Rob's work, and the farmer that brought the evidence to him and got the ball rolling. But without these lawyers, basically, we're left with few protections, and it shouldn't be that way. Definitely shouldn't be that way.
Right. I noticed that when I'm speaking with, let's say, Robert or similar, very careful, because it's like you can feel like he's had 80 different arrows shot at him. So he's like, I'm just going to be cautious here. This. That's true. Carey, on this one, I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode of the show. This is the book, The Monsanto Papers. This is the author, Carey Gillam. Glad to have had you on.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Cool. And we are out.